a massive failure for those international advisors to Assad to not see this coming. I mean, everyone knows that the Assad regime itself is incredibly weak and is dependent on this support, and that support clearly failed. Not his fault that the Russian planes and the Russian, military advisors had all been relocated to Ukraine, but more kinetically, as they say, to use the jargon. You've also seen Russian planes rejoin the bombing of those rebel areas in response to this attack.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the reigniting of the civil war in Syria and its wider implications for the Middle East, for Russia, and for the rest of the world. And joining us to discuss it, I'm delighted to be joined by the Times correspondent Richard Spencer. He's currently the paper's China correspondent, but up until 2023 was the paper's Middle East correspondent, covering topics including the fallout from the Syrian civil war. Richard, welcome to Frontline. First of all, why do you think this conflict has reignited now?
That's a question that falls into two halves, really. So why did it reignite? And there, I think it's important to say it never really went away. It was a frozen conflict for a number of years, but never quite as frozen in the way that some other sort of frozen contexts that we talk about were frozen. I mean, it was so the Syrian civil war, which began effectively in 2011, sort of came to an end in two parts. One in 2016, when the regime took Aleppo back from the rebels in the north of the country, and basically took control of most of the heavily populated parts of the western half of Syria. And then the second freeze, if you like, came when mainly the Western Alliance and their local allies on the ground, some Kurdish forces, a few Arab militias, managed to defeat ISIS in the east of the country, and that sort of effectively ended the major fighting in the war in 2019 in the various parts of the Syrian conflict. But I think everyone realized that was an inherently unstable situation. The country was effectively divided into four parts. The regime-held territory, the rebel-held territory, a separate rebel group that was controlled by Turkey, and then in the east, this area controlled by essentially a Kurdish-led administration with Western backing. I mean, that was unstable, and there was fighting on the front lines between many different participants. This jihadi group, the Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham in the northwest, fighting between Turkish-backed forces and the Kurdish forces in the northeast. ISIS still, staging attacks. So there was always, a war continuing at a sort of much lower level. The reason it's exploded now is that this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, has changed the way it's run northwest Syria. It's dropped some of its jihadi rhetoric. It's become much more of a settled administration. It's set up services. It's worked with aid groups, international aid groups, to set up services for its people. And in the meantime, it's been, working out its next steps. And it took the opportunity when the Assad regime's backers were otherwise distracted to launch this attack. I mean, Assad depended on his survival on Iran, on Hezbollah, the Lebanese militia, and on Russia. And these are all fighting other wars at the moment. Hezbollah has been fighting Israel. Russia is fighting in Ukraine. Iran is deeply involved in that Gaza conflict as well, and has many internal problems. It's been attacked by Israel as a result of that war. So all these defenders of the regime are severely weakened. So they seized the opportunity and went on the attack. This group, Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, and I think to their surprise, those defenses were even weaker than expected and just fell away.
Well, let's explore some of those alliances you mentioned, notably with Russia and Iran. I mean, with Russia to begin with, why is there such a strong alliance, Richard, between the Assad regime and Vladimir Putin? Because some might say, look, Vladimir Putin's got enough on his plate at the moment, and yet over the weekend we've seen Russian airstrikes on Aleppo. So what explains the importance of Syria to Russia?
Well, two things. One is history, and two is America. So the history is very important. In the Cold War, Syria was part of the Soviet sort of broader alliance of states. and it has a Russian naval base. So at Tartus, which is on the little stretch of Mediterranean coastline that Syria has, there is this very important Russian naval base. It's a war, it's what the geostrategists call a warm water port. It's a Russian port that doesn't freeze up in winter. So that's a very important place for Russia to have naval warships that can operate anywhere in the world, but certainly in the Mediterranean. So that alliance is very important. And then in the Arab Spring, the idea of states that had been allied to Russia becoming, democratic, perhaps with Western support and becoming more pro-Western, and certainly maybe turning against Russia, was something that Putin uh, couldn't allow to happen. So he intervened to stop that happening, and he intervened with military force. It was part of that wider Putin strategy of not allowing sort of color revolutions, democratic uprisings, as he saw it, be used as a cover for, increasing American influence at the expense of Russian influence.
And he clearly does, Vladimir Putin, still place a degree of import on what's happening in Syria because, according to reports, he has fired the Russian head of the military mission to Syria in the wake of the weekend.
Indeed, he has. I mean, clearly a massive failure for those international advisors to Assad to not see this coming. I mean, everyone knows that the Assad regime itself is incredibly weak and is dependent on this support, and that support clearly failed. Not his fault that the Russian planes and the Russian, military advisors had all been relocated to Ukraine, but more kinetically, as they say, to use the jargon. You've also seen Russian planes rejoin the bombing of those rebel areas in response to this attack.
And then obviously you mentioned the other key ally for the Assad regime is Iran. What does this now mean for Iran? Does this further isolate Iran after what has already been a very difficult year for them and their allies?
Yeah, it's very bad news for Iran. I think the prognosis for Iran really depends on how far this attack goes. There are various schools of thought on how this regime, how this assault on Aleppo was planned, and as I say, whether anyone really expected it to be quite so successful. Now, there are people, particularly people who want to see the Iranian regime fall and are keen on regime change in Iran, who are rather hopefully saying, oh, talking about a whole realignment of the Middle East. If the regime, if this attack, carries on, makes it to Damascus, removes the regime, Iran is removed from Syria, then it's Iran's connection, land bridge to Lebanon and Hezbollah and these other Iranian militias are then blocked. Maybe some deal could be done with Assad to save Assad if he kicks out the Iranians, perhaps with support from some of the Gulf countries that don't like Iran. All these things are now up in the air and being talked about. My suspicion is that this was intended to be a much more limited attack, and is actually much more to do with Turkey's strategic interests. Turkey wants to stabilize that northern border, wants to push back Kurdish forces, which are aligned to the PKK, which fight this guerrilla war in Turkey. They and Erdogan, as part of that, wanted to normalize relations with Assad. That would also have the effect that he might be able to put some of those millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey back to Syria, and he was strategizing along those lines, and Assad didn't really cooperate. So there's one idea that in some way Turkey greenlit this attack. Certainly, some of the units that it supports in northern Turkey took part in the attacks. In which case, it's much more. There's a much more limited end goal, if you like, if Turkey is saying, okay, well, you can go this far, but not much further. The regime are already mounting their defenses. They're sending tanks north to the front lines. Those front lines have slowed down somewhat. We'll have to see if they try and retake Aleppo. I mean, there's a possibility of a huge bloodbath as the regime try and repeat what they did in 2016. It's a blow. So it's a blow for Iran. I think it really remains to be seen whether there is such a huge strategic fallout that its position in Syria is ended in some way.
Just on the fighting itself, you talk about whether the Assad regime will be able to retake Aleppo. How would you rate that chance, and how strong are Hayat Tahrir al-Sham?
So they are quite well organized now. They're better organized than they were a few years ago. Whether they have the manpower and certainly whether they have the firepower to actually take on the regime, if the regime brings up, huge amounts of well-trained men driving tanks, and really brings its air force to bear, and Russia again and Iran come to their support, it's hard to see them holding on forever, but they will defend it quite strongly, as they and the other rebel groups did in 2016, which again raises horrific possibilities for loss of life, loss of civilian life. A really, really nasty battle awaits on that front if that's how it pans out. If there is some broader realignment, re-strategizing, I mean, there are various ideas that you can work with to prevent that happening. But the betting has to be on that. And Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, they have taken a lot of hardware, like they have taken tanks and armored personnel carriers and so on from Assad military bases in the past week. But whether they have the men trained to use them, whether they have enough to actually defend against a combined assault by regime forces with backing from Russia and Iran, I somewhat doubt. And in any case, it will be very, very bloody.
And what about their ability potentially to push on even further? I mean, apparently they might be moving south towards Hama, which is another city a bit further south. But then what about Damascus? I mean, could they even push on to Damascus?
Well, as I say, I suspect not, and I suspect that wasn't even the plan. The plan. I mean, I'm sure they'd like to now. They've got started, and I'm sure even if Turkey said, "Well, we didn't really mean this to happen, and we're not in support of it," that wouldn't stop them trying. But as I say, the advance has slowed. Some units did get to the outskirts of Hama at the weekend, and then were pushed back or withdrawn. They're now working through some of the countryside between sort of northwest of Hama. It's not a huge distance to Damascus in terms of miles, but they are venturing into territory where they haven't been for years. These rebel groups, and there isn't a huge amount of sign of an uprising from within. The security forces still seem to have that tied down. People in Damascus are saying that there hasn't been much fallout there as yet, and it is it's not a big difference in terms of miles, but it is in terms of some military operations. So I suspect not.
And what would you say, Richard, is the prognosis now for the Assad regime, which has managed to kind of cling to power ever since 2011 and the Arab Spring? And Syria was readmitted to the Arab League, I believe, last year. So it's managed to regain some of its regional credibility. What does it mean for the regime now?
Never underestimate the clingability of Bashar al-Assad. He defied what a lot of people were saying in 2011, 2012, who thought that he would go the way of Hosni Mubarak and Gaddafi. That in some ways he had a choice. Did he want the Mubarak exit or the Gaddafi exit? But he said, no, I'm going to stay. And he managed to use those alliances that his father had forged, basically, between Syria, Russia, and Iran to his own advantage. And I suspect he will do the same. I think it's weakened. As you say, there's a big difference from 2012, and that he's now speaking to the Arab world again. They cut him off before. Several of those Gulf states, particularly, both as governments and their people, sent money and arms to the rebels. No sign of that happening again. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is, as I say, it's moderated its stance and its government style since it was its predecessor organization, Jabhat al-Nusra, was part of al-Qaeda. It's broken those ties with al-Qaeda. It's tried to present a much more organized face of government, if you like, and it's specifically said that it's not the Taliban, for example, so there is education of women going on in its areas. It says it's not going to discriminate against minorities. Church services carried on in Aleppo, but it's still a designated terrorist organization in most countries, including Britain and America. So that limits the support they can receive from the outside world, even from Turkey, which doesn't designate it, but it does have an effect on Turkish support if Turkey wants to support this. So that's there are huge limits to what this group can achieve, I think.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. And in terms of the wider international reaction, China's foreign ministry has come out and said that it supports Syria's efforts to maintain national security and stability, and that China is willing to make positive efforts to prevent further deterioration of the situation in Syria. What is Beijing's view of this, and what do you think they mean by positive efforts in this context?
Good question. That on both fronts. I mean, historically, China slipstreamed behind Russia on this. So back in 2011, 2012, when I was reporting on all the various UN discussions on this issue, China was a very quiet voice, but it did come in behind Russia on vetoing various attempts to impose UN sanctions on Assad or give other forms of UN-backed diplomatic support to the opposition. Russia did take part in various peace processes, which led to various UN resolutions, but the more aggressive ones were vetoed by Russia with Chinese support. So China's coming quite strongly morally, if you like, behind Russia's support for Assad, and therefore behind Assad as well. That didn't lead to much practical consequences. You haven't seen China providing weapons to Syria, to the regime, for example, nor has there been much diplomatic attempt to intervene. You haven't seen lots of Chinese envoys going and standing beside Assad, or Assad getting state visits to Beijing or anything like that. There is obviously the implication of that is, do you look at Ukraine, where China is accused of providing dual-use equipment? So, China says that it is not providing weapons to Russia for the war in Ukraine, but there's no doubt that it's providing, technical support in the sense of it's providing electronics and other components that are being used in the Russian arms industry to build new tanks and whatever to resupply their front lines, and that's something that's angered the West. So in that sense, if Russia continues to support Syria, then China is also part of that. Is there some hint there that China regards this as such a priority that it would go one step further in actually providing money or arms to Syria? That would be a great break with Chinese military tradition, which is not to get involved in these conflicts far away in such a direct way. And I suspect it doesn't really regard it as part of its own vital national interests. But who knows? It has close ties with Iran as well, gets lots of its oil from Iran. So through these various backdoor means, you may see it sort of lending support in more physical ways.
And then if you're the US, either the outgoing Biden administration or the incoming Trump administration, how are you viewing this? Are you viewing this as a potential way to further weaken Iran, and so potentially a positive development? Or are you viewing this as bringing fresh turbulence to a region that doesn't need any more?
I actually think the former. I suspect that that the American establishment, well, if there is such a thing as the American establishment anymore, it's very hard to know with America whether there is such a thing as America when it comes to international affairs, because Trump and Biden speak so different about it, but also elements within the Trump movement speak so differently about it. This big split between the the isolationists who just want to pull out of all these conflicts, and those who have a very much more aggressive pursuit of what they regard as their interests in terms of taking on Iran and pariah states and so on. So it's a very complex issue for America, just because America is a very complex place for all these issues at the moment. The Biden administration, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, said the other day, he said, obviously we're not in favor of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a terrorist group, and we're not in favor of chaos, but we're not against anything that puts pressure on the Assad regime. So I paraphrase, but he showed the ambiguity there. I suspect Biden is not really thinking this is going to be any of his business. I don't think there's any great American strategy around this. No one expected it to happen. Lots of people are talking about it for sure. But this is going to be playing out during this transition period. And as for Trump, I mean, who knows what his thinking about Syria is. There will be a lot of people, and all I can say is there will be a lot of people in the Trump environs, if you like, a lot of people in his transition team, and amongst people who are taking up positions in the Middle East in his new administration, who will be saying, yes, this is the time to organize a major pushback against Iran using this. And I say one possibility, which I suspect some of those Trump appointees and advisors are looking at, is trying to get some sort of deal together whereby, for example, Assad is given support against these rebels, but on condition that he tries to get rid of Iran. I don't think that will work, but I suspect that will be one of the things they're thinking of. If he gets rid of Iran, he could get out of the Syrian environment. Then you could get more support from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, to rebuild Syria, more money to rebuild Syria, and that would cut off, Iran's supply line to the border with Israel, to groups in Syria and Lebanon that are sending rockets into Israel. I don't think Assad would ever do that. I think that reliance is too strong, but I suspect that some people in Washington are thinking that way.
And just finally, Richard, where do you see things on the ground in Syria going from here? Do you think that the Assad regime may be able to regain control relatively quickly and it'll return to being, as you described it, almost a frozen conflict? Or do you think this reignition of the civil war is going to continue for some time?
No, I mean, if you wanted me to sort of sketch out what I think will happen, I mean, on the basis of, I might be right, I might be wrong. I mean, it's a very fluid situation, and no one predicted what has happened. So my guess that the most likely thing that will happen is that in the next week or so, you will see the regime start to get its act together. I'd say the advance is already slowing. I suspect a new front line will emerge across northwestern Syria, between Hama and Aleppo. There's a very sub question of whether the regime can go south into Latakia, which is a very regime-dominated area, because it's where the Alawite minority are mostly based, which is that minority that the Assads are part of that rule Syria. But I suspect they will not get there. I would suspect they will not get to Hama, that new front lines will emerge. At that point, when those merge, they will be stable for a while Assad talks to Russia and talks to Iran and tries to plot their counterattack. But I wouldn't expect to see that counterattack immediately. I may be wrong about that. There will certainly be an intensive bombing of rebel areas, which will cause a lot of civilian casualties. But an actual physical assault might happen next year, I suspect, maybe in the spring. That's my guess. In the meantime, other issues will play out, like the Kurdish little areas in northern Western Syria. We're already seeing the groups that control those areas, the SDF, or with their, which is the Western backed force, and the YPG, which is the Kurdish element of that force, which controls these small areas northeast of Aleppo. They're already evacuating. There might be some, there is already civilian displacement of Kurds who don't like Tahrir al-Sham. They don't like the rebel groups, particularly the ones backed by Turkey. So there's going to be a lot of other sort of little subplots in this story. There'll be realignment in northeast as the SDF absorb those refugees, work out how to deal with the new security environment that they face. All these there'll be things going on in the south where there are already more skirmishes between rebels who had laid down their weapons in 2016 and between 2016 and 2019 in the south and were formerly under Assad rule, but there's skirmishes there going on. So there'll be lots of other things going on, but I suspect that main front line will stabilize, and then I suspect you'll see a counterattack by the regime, backed by Russia, backed by Iran and its militias when they've got their act together.
Richard Spencer, really appreciate your insight and your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.